Righty ho, folks. I'm going to close the chat and let's get on with this talk. So, Herihor, here he is on the left-hand side here, in an image from a papyrus belonging to his wife, who's also with him here. This is Nojmet, his wife. This I decided that this would be a good subject for a talk. Actually, when I was preparing for my previous talk, which was about the royal mummies and specifically the cache tomb, Theban tomb 320, the royal cache tomb as it's come to be known. And in the process of talking about that, those of you who perhaps were there will know that I wanted to go into the history behind the cache and the process that brought all of those mummies in there, which is actually quite a complicated process. And those of you who are at the talk or know the subject via other means will know that it isn't the case that the royal mummies were all simply moved to this one place or one or two places in one go. They were actually moved around quite a lot to various different places over the course of several decades. So the caching process probably began in the early 21st dynasty, and in fact the last dated activity in Theban tomb 320 is in fact in the early 22nd dynasty, so far from it being something that was a kind of single day or two's work. It was a very long and complicated process, and in order to try and understand how that worked and what the sequence of events was, we were looking a little bit at the history of the 21st dynasty and some of the leading characters. And we also looked, it's a preoccupation of mine, at the individuals, the high-ranking individuals who were not represented in that cache and the one other major cache of royal and high-ranking individuals, KB 35, the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings, because there are these conspicuous gaps. And one of those gaps relates to the subject of today's talk, Herihor. He's one of quite a small number of royal or very sort of top level people whose mummy wasn't found in those caches, whose tomb's never been identified, and in fact certain archaeologists and others have claimed nothing at all of his funerary equipment, no trace of his tomb or burial of any kind has appeared on the antiquities market or in museum collections, museum basements, whatever, giving rise to the idea that the tomb is still yet to be found and in fact is intact. So there's a story here, and indeed it's a story that I covered in my Lost Tombs book. So I thought this was quite a nice and natural evolution from the royal mummies talk. Before we go any further, I just want to say at the outset, for anybody who's not familiar with the story, just some sort of headlines about Herihor, who he is, who he was, and what his role was in this pivotal period in Egyptian history. So this is Herihor. On the left-hand side here, it's a damaged relief. This is from the temple of Khonsu at Karnak. So not the main Amun temple at Karnak, but it's within the Amun enclosure. It's a freestanding temple in its own right, dedicated to Khonsu, who is the child of Amun and his principal consort, Mut. It's nowhere near as big as the Amun temple, but it's nonetheless, it's a very substantial temple in its own right, and it's actually very well preserved, and it represents building from a relatively short period at the end of the New Kingdom and into the 21st dynasty. So it appears to be more of a sort of a unity than the Amun temple, which is a sprawling mass of constructions of various periods from over 2,000 years and more. And it was decorated by, among others, Herihor. And here he is on the left-hand side. The figure, as I've said, is damaged, particularly the head and what would have been visible of the face. But his figure is here, and we can see that he's making an offering of a mart symbol, a symbol of cosmic harmony and justice to the god Amun-Ra, who stands before him. His figure is also defaced, but his twin plumed crown is still well preserved. So it's clear that's him, not only from that, but from the label text above him as well. So there's a text identifying Amun-Ra, in fact, Amun-Ra, the lord of the thrones of the two lands. And this individual on the left is clearly Herihor, as we can see from his titles here. So just zooming in a bit, this is Herihor offering Mart, and his name and titles are given here as follows. He's the lord of the two lands, and the Chief Priest of Amun title is enclosed within a name ring, a cartouche, which is a bit odd. Then he's described as the lord of arisings, the son of Amun, Herihor. So this looks like royal titulary. It looks like pharaonic titulary. And you know, if you didn't read the signs and you looked at this, you would definitely think, well, this is pharaoh. Here he is in a temple relief, exactly as you would expect of pharaoh, making offerings to the gods, exactly as you would expect, shown at the same scale of as the god, implying a kind of equivalence. And you know, with names written in cartouches. There's an image of the goddess Wadis shown as a falcon here above him. Everything about this says that this is the king. But the classic title, the most important designator of pharaoh, the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, is not present here. And in fact, there's no word for king at all here. And what is curious about the way that the two cartouches are written is, as I've said, that the title Chief Priest of Amun is enclosed within a cartouche as if this is the name. It's not. It's the title that he held, or it's one of them. So here we have somebody who is Chief Priest of Amun, an important title, but nonetheless it's not the title of king, but behaving in almost every other way as if they were king. In fact, Herihor was not only the chief priest of Amun-Ra, king of gods, as this version of the title has it at the top here, but he was also Imi Meshar Wer and Shemau Mehu and Hauti, which altogether means something like commander-in-chief of the armies of the south and the north, and the Hauti is another military title, generalissimo, general, commander, that sort of thing. So he's in charge of two of the most important institutions in the country. Apparently, he's at the head of the temple, one of the three largest and most important cult centers in the country, the others being Ptah at Memphis and sun god Ra at Heliopolis, but Karnak possibly bigger than those other two. This puts him not only in charge of religious activity, but all of the economy that the temple controlled as well. That's people who were employed as priests, scribes, craftsmen of various kinds. And then also the agricultural land, which belongs ostensibly to the god, but it is controlled by the temple, and all of the product of that land would be sent to the temple in the form of offerings to the gods and then redistributed under the authority of the chief priest to all of these staff. So temples functioned as a kind of micro economy. And as the person at the head of that, Herihor was a very powerful person. And as the person at the head of the army as well. This also would, of course, make him, in addition, a powerful person. So he fits in, or at least as far as this reconstruction of the history that I've committed to here, he fits in at the beginning of the period of the 21st dynasty, or end of the 20th and into the 21st. Now, as we'll see, scholars are still arguing about exactly where Herihor fits into the sequence. But nonetheless, if we sort of zoom out a little bit here, the purpose of showing you this chart at this point is just to emphasize that the main characteristic feature of the political geographical situation in Egypt in the 21st dynasty is this split in the country. So the kings of Manetho's 20th dynasty, the last of whom was Ramesses the 11th, were succeeded by, according to Manetho, a 21st dynasty composed of kings who, in his list, and I've put the Manethonic names at the left-hand side here, were Smendes, Neferkeres, Susenes, Amenophthes, Osokor, Sinakes, and Susenes, who in the Egyptian evidence are this group of kings here. The Greek forms of the name in Manetho are fairly easy to read in the Egyptian. The exceptions are Smendes, which becomes Nezubar-Nebjed. I think it's important to just point that out here, because when you're reading the literature, depending on whose book or article you're reading, you might see this king referred to more commonly as Smendes, but occasionally as Nezubar-Nebjed. That's closer to the Egyptian original. And then the other one that doesn't really match is Susenes, and again, that's the name that's more commonly written in the literature, but the Egyptian is Parsebkai-Nut. Again, depending on whose book you're reading, you might see one or the other of those, so don't be tripped up there. Nezubar-Nebjed and Smendes are the same person. Susenes and Parsebkai-Nut are the same person as well. And so those kings succeed the 20th dynasty kings, and they are based in the north and have control of the north of the country. In the south, the king had lost control by the end of the 20th dynasty, it seems, and control had passed to a line of individuals, including Herihor, who held a variety of titles, but the one they use more than any other, or the one they use more prominently than any other, is the title of Chief Priest of Amun. And in fact, their authority seems to have come directly from the god Amun. It makes sense for them to use that title more than any other, because that kind of emphasizes their divine authority, if you like. Their commands, their laws, their decisions were made increasingly from this point onwards via oracles. So these would be ostensibly the expressions of the will of the god, handed down to Herihor and co, who would then enact the orders. So he is a powerful individual and part of this line of chief priests who are in control of the south at this time. And as I mentioned, so he has kind of quasi-royal status. We'll look a little bit later at the extent to which somebody like Herihor should really be referred to as a king, a priest who became a king, as I have it in the title of the talk, or whether or not that's really appropriate in this period. And the fact that his tomb hasn't turned up means, particularly if we are to consider him as a kind of Theban king, it does make it a kind of conspicuous gap in the records, because we have so much evidence for the burials, even if it's reburials, of the kings for, to some extent, the 17th, but most of the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. And in fact, we have the burials of a number of the 21st dynasty kings and the number of the 21st dynasty chief priests as well. So there really is something sort of exceptional, if you like, about the fact that we apparently have no evidence for the burial of Herihor. We do have evidence for the burial of his wife Nojmet, and she was buried in TT 320, Theban tomb 320, part of the cache. So it seems there's no evidence of Herihor in that cache, so it seems the two of them somehow came to be separated in death. But Herihor crops up on this papyrus, as we saw in the opening slide. So the image that I used there is actually this one down here, but he also appears slightly further along the same papyrus here, wearing a slightly different bit of headgear. But in both cases, he's wearing a uraeus diadem, a cobra diadem, which of course is one of the traditional symbols of kingship, and his name is written in the text of the papyrus in a cartouche as well. So again, if you were to just take a quick glance at this without looking at all the details, you'd assume that this was a king wearing the uraeus and name in a cartouche. It's a king, right? So so here we are. We have some evidence for Nojmet's burial, but not Herihor's, and that's going to be driving the second part of our talk here, the quest for his tomb. So to go into the background of the period in a little bit more detail, those of you who came to my talks on either the Silver Pharaohs or the TIP Untangled, which I gave a few weeks ago, will know all about this, but it's a complicated period. So even if you were at those talks, I hope you might appreciate this little refresher. The New Kingdom, of course, comprises the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. And from more or less the beginning of the 20th dynasty onwards, and the list of kings of that dynasty is at the top right here, beginning with Sethnacht, and then a procession of kings with the name Ramesses III through to the 11th. And from the beginning of this time, no later than the reign of Ramesses III, there is growing evidence that Egypt was experiencing some difficulties. So I'm sorry it's such a terrible photograph, but the papyrus at the bottom left is the famous Turin strike papyrus, so-called, now in the Museo Egizio in Turin. It is a record of what we believe is the earliest attested industrial strike in history. Essentially, the workmen of Deir el-Medina, the workmen who were responsible for the cutting of tombs in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere, were not being paid by the state, and they hadn't received their wages for a significant period of time, and so they staged a sit-in at Medinet Habu, the temple which we see in the aerial photograph from the bottom right here. This is the temple enclosure. Deir el-Medina is just over here, so not very far away. Medinet Habu had become a kind of administrative center. There were already buildings on the site prior to Ramesses III building his temple there. Incidentally, it's not as though it was a virgin site before that. But obviously Ramesses III built a very large temple there, and an enclosure wall, and a number of buildings around the edge. But this became, in the 20th dynasty, a sort of center and in its own right. And eventually, the villagers of Deir el-Medina moved there because it was a more defensible spot than the village itself. So we have evidence for a strike. In the same papyrus, we have some of the earliest evidence that, again, motivated by not receiving their wages, some of the workmen decided to take it upon themselves to go and try and rob a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of Ramesses II, in fact, to extract a bit of wealth from that in lieu of their wages. And tomb robbery, as we know from various other sources, becomes an increasing problem in the 20th dynasty and into the 21st. We also know from the reliefs at Medinet Habu that Ramesses III was engaged in battle with two groups of people, most famously the Sea Peoples, the mysterious Sea Peoples, and also various groups of Libyans, nomadic peoples from the deserts to the west of Egypt, who at this time had come to cross over into Egypt. And of course, temple reliefs, Egyptian temple reliefs being what they are, it's in their nature to present such confrontations as glorious victories for Pharaoh. But in actual fact, reading between the lines, it seems likely that even if Ramesses III and the Egyptian armies had been successful on certain occasions in repelling the Libyans, it's very clear from the fact that they were settling in significant numbers and came to play a very important part in Egyptian society in succeeding periods, that they weren't entirely successful in repelling them. And in fact, we don't really know whether what the nature of these Libyan incursions was, whether it was, gangs of heavily armed, marauding Libyan warriors, or whether this is more a case of ordinary people just coming to the Nile Valley to look for somewhere to live where they could feed themselves. It seems likely that wider events driven by perhaps environmental change across the Mediterranean world actually were prompting groups like the Libyans and the Sea Peoples to come somewhere like Egypt, because environmental conditions were making it very difficult for them to lead their lives. In any case, though, Libyans in particular came to settle in the Theban area, and in fact up and down the Nile Valley, very much in the Delta as well, during the 20th dynasty and beyond. And there's a certain amount of evidence that this caused a bit of friction among the local population. And it's this kind of thing that led to, as I said, the villagers of Del Medina upping sticks from the village itself and resettling within the temple walls at Medina Habu, where they could more easily defend themselves. So it's a tricky time, the 20th dynasty. And towards the end of the period, the position of Chief Priest of Amun at Karnak had come to be occupied by a man called Amenhotep, who we see in the left-hand side of the photograph here. He's shown with his king, Pharaoh Ramesses IX. He's dated to Ramesses IX, Ramesses X, and in fact we know that he was still in office in the time of Ramesses XI as well. This relief in itself is interesting because it shows Amenhotep and Ramesses IX as being of equivalent scale. So this is what we saw in the relief of Herihor and Amun-Ra, and in that case, it's sort of appropriate in that the person who is in direct communion with the gods, normally the king, is shown at the same scale, implying a kind of equivalence of status. But ordinarily, kings and gods would be shown at a much larger scale than mortal, ordinary individuals, again, emphasizing that difference in status. Gods and kings much more important than the rest of us. But that's not the case here. We've got a mortal, earthly individual, the chief priest of Amun, albeit an important one, at equivalent level, implying equivalent status to the king. So we can perhaps read into this an increase in the importance and authority of the chief priest vis-a-vis a decline, a relative decline in the authority, power, importance of the king. At a certain point, and I've said regnal year 17 or 18 here, but we can't necessarily be as precise as that. It could have been earlier. In the reign of Ramesses XI, we have snatches of evidence from a variety of sources that there was some kind of war against the high priest Amenhotep, sometimes referred to as the suppression of the high priest Amenhotep, or the transgression against the high priest. We don't quite know what the nature of this was, but anyway, somebody comes into conflict with the chief priest, and that somebody is the viceroy of Nubia, a man called Parnexi. So he's the king's deputy, the governor of Nubia on behalf of the king, if you like. And for some reason, he is prompted to make the journey from Nubia, where he's based, to Thebes to restore order. It's not clear what the nature of the disorder was, but apparently there was something that needed fixing. In the process of doing this, he became the overseer of the granaries so that he could feed his troops. And he is therefore in conflict with the high priest Amenhotep. And in response to this, the high priest Amenhotep appeals to the king in the north for help. We subsequently also learn that Parnexi, the viceroy of Nubia, destroyed, again, difficult to know exactly what the meaning of the Egyptian here is, but there's some kind of conflagration as far north as the town of Hardai, which in later times was known as Sinopolis. It's in the 17th nome of Upper Egypt, in what is today Minya province, so quite a long way further north from Thebes. It's not clear why Parnexi was going there, whether that was his final destination or whether he was heading even further north. We just have this snatched reference to the fact that he was there. The appeal to the king on the part of Amenhotep results in a general being dispatched from the north to Thebes to repel Parnexi. We don't know who this was, but this general was successful and Parnexi was chased out of Thebes back to Nubia. So that's the end of Parnexi's involvement in Thebes as far as we know. There are two candidates for this act of repelling Parnexi. One of them is a man called Pai Ankh, who we see in the drawing of a stela from Abydos, a drawing by Mariette on the left-hand side here, or our Herihor. Both of these individuals we know were military generals who also ascended to the important position of chief priest, presumably as a successor to Amenhotep. The trouble is we don't know which one of them it was at this point, which one of them came first. They both held both these titles, commander of the army and chief priest of Amun. We just don't know which one of them held it first. In any case, shortly after the conflict between the general, whoever it was, and Parnexi, we see in the evidence a new era, an era which begins at the same time as Ramesses XI's reign was ongoing. And from this point onwards, events in Thebes are dated to this new era. So rather than dating to the reign of a king, such and such a thing happened in year such and such of king such and such, events are now dated to this new era. And it's called, the Egyptian phrase for it is Wehem Mezut. Literally translated, this means something like repetition, repeating births. So it's often referred to in the literature for this reason as kind of Renaissance. I don't really like that translation myself because I think it has too much to do with Florence and Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo in people's imaginations. So I prefer myself to stick to the Egyptian and just call it Wehem Mezut. In any case, the meaning of the Egyptian seems to conjure up ideas of a kind of new start, if you like. And it's difficult not to think that this new start is brought about by the arrival of the king's general in Thebes and the expulsion of Parnexi. Whichever one of these generals it was, Parnexi or Herihor, of course, as we've seen, they come to occupy the position of chief priest of Amun. And in fact, Payank in particular comes to hold a whole sequence of other titles as well, making this person more powerful than any other Thebes-based individual had been at this point. And that perhaps also is again why we have this new era and a new dating system that runs in parallel with the dating system of the king in the north. It's probably the beginning of the point at which the king begins to lose control of the south to a newly super powerful individual. We know we have a number of inscriptions of various kinds, texts of various kinds, which are dated to the Wehem Mezut. We have a number of graffiti, which are dated to that period, relating to things like tomb inspections. We have a number of letters. Collectively, that corpus of letters is known as the late Ramesside letters. These are often slightly sort of garbled and convoluted, but they contain snatches of information that have allowed scholars to piece things together. So one of those snatches, for example, is this idea of Parnexi going north to Hardai to destroy the town, whatever that might mean. And there's enough of these snatches for us to begin to piece together a sequence. One of the important such snatches of information relates to a year 10 of Wehem Mezut, so that would be equivalent to year 29 of Ramesses XI. As far as we can tell, that's just about the end of his reign. At this point, Payank, the general, led an army to Nubia to meet Parnexi. And again, the nature of this meeting is obscure to us. You might think that Parnexi was causing a nuisance again, and so Payank decided that he would go all the way to Nubia to engage him in battle. But we don't know that. The general, whoever it was, just prior to the beginning of Wehem Mezut, Herihor or Payank, was apparently dispatched to Thebes by the king, was acting as his agent. But we don't know whether that person, and whether in this case Payank, was acting as an agent of the king, or whether by this point they are independent of the king. It's quite possible that Payank might actually have gone to Nubia to negotiate with Parnexi, and perhaps having realized that there was more for him to gain by a friendly relationship in perhaps conflict with the king. We don't know this, and I only really mention that partly just to give you a sense of how fragile our understanding of exactly the nature of the events at this time is. In any case, Parnexi, by the way, died in Nubia. Obviously, we don't really hear from him again after this point at which Payank engages him. He was buried in a tomb at Aniba, not a very spectacular tomb, but we do know where he was buried. In fact, as well, Payank comes to take on the title of Viceroy of Nubia. So it seems that following Parnesi's demise, Payang gathered that up into his huge long list of titles. But following that, the title of Viceroy of Nubia pretty much disappears. I think I'm right in saying he's the last holder of that title, signifying that Egypt has lost its control of Nubia by this point. So that's another aspect of the decline, if you like, of Egypt, at least as a kind of centralized power at the center of an empire. So here we are. As I say, year 10 Payang, the point at which year 10 Wehem Mesut, the point at which Payang visits Parnesi in Nubia, is just about the end of the reign of Ramesses the 11th, and the point of transition from the 20th dynasty to the 21st. The point at which we now have a clear split in the country. So by the way, just to orient ourselves geography-wise, the king at this time is, I keep saying he's based up in the north. More specifically, until the end of the 20th dynasty, this had been the case since the beginning of the 19th. The capital had been at the site of Paramesi, which is up here in the northeastern delta, not a million miles away from where the Hyksos had, prior to that, had their capital at Avaris. At the end of the 20th dynasty and beginning of the 21st, not exactly sure when this happened, but round about the same point as we make the transition to the 21st, the capital city moved from Paramesi about 30 kilometers to the north to the site of Tanis. You may know this story. The temple area at Tanis is furnished with huge stone blocks bearing the name of Ramesses II, which for a long time fooled scholars into thinking that Tanis was the site of ancient Paramesi, the capital of the 19th and 20th dynasties, founded by Ramesses II himself. In actual fact, we now realize that Paramesi itself was at the site of the modern village of Kantia. The reason so much of Ramesses II's stone temple is now at Tanis is that when the capital city moved, rather than quarry a whole load of new stone and build a brand new temple, the ancients at that time found it much more convenient just to dismantle Ramesses' stone temple and move it 30 kilometers. So they rebuilt a temple, and in fact tombs and various other things, out of this recycled stone. Fooled archaeologists for a long time. It seems, by the way, the reason for the move was that Paramesi had been built on a branch of the Nile, making it very convenient for transport to the Mediterranean coast and in the other direction to Memphis, to the main branch of the Nile in the Nile Valley. But that branch had begun to silt up in the later New Kingdom, and eventually it became unviable. So they needed to move to another spot, Tanis, which was fed at this point by another branch of the Nile, the branch we call the Tanitic branch. Doesn't exist anymore, but it did in ancient times. So it was purely a practical move. We don't exactly know where the boundary between the two territories was. The chief priests, of course, are based at Karnak, 3 kilometers to the north of modern Luxor, which is the site of ancient Thebes. We don't exactly know where the boundary was, but it was most probably somewhere in this area around the Fayum. There's a number of settlements which became very important in the Third Intermediate period, fortified settlements as well. And it seems that these were places where troops were stationed in significant numbers. So they have the character of kind of border towns. We're not exactly sure which one of them represents the frontier, or whether there's a kind of grey area, no man's land in between. But it's in the region of sites such as El Hiba, Heracleopolis Magna, both of those important Third Intermediate period sites. There was another fortress in the region in slightly later times called Per Sechem Kepre, which we've never been able to identify on the ground, but it's believed to have been in this region. So that's approximately where the border is. It's not quite the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt, but it's not too far off. But the north includes Memphis and Heliopolis, and obviously the new capital city at Tanis, and the south, most of the Nile Valley, about as far as the Fayum. So that's the lie of the land. So there's this question about whether or not Herihor comes first or Payank comes first, and that's also a question of who the general was who was dispatched by Pharaoh to go and meet Parnexi and repel him. For a long time, it was thought that it was Herihor who was dispatched, who repelled Parnexi, and who was the inaugurator of the Wehem Mezut. He's very prominent in the archaeological record, particularly when you think of temple reliefs like this one at Karnak in the Khonsu temple. And the fact of his being a kind of, Theban priest king, this new idea of a kind of southern equivalent to the king, all seem to fit quite nicely. We've got a new era, got somebody claiming new authority, having themselves depicted in this new way for a non-pharaoh. It all seems to fit quite nicely. It's also true that the chief priests of all of the rest of the 21st dynasty were relatives of Payank, but not of Herihor's, or at least that's what we realize now. It was, in fact, until recently believed that Payank was a son of Herihor. And if that was right, then, of course, that would make this sequence, Herihor, Payank, all of the rest of the 21st dynasty chief priests who are descendants of Payank. That would make that very straightforward. Very unlikely, if Herihor was Payank's father, that Payank came first and his father after him. But this is, in fact, based on a mistake. So we can see, by the way, here, so this is Payank. This is, I'm afraid, a rather complicated family tree that involves the 21st dynasty kings in Tanis, as well as the chief priest and their family members. But the individuals who are highlighted in red here are the chief priests of the 21st dynasty. So Payank and Herihor actually maybe both married the same Nojmet. That's not absolutely clear, and people are still arguing about that. But they certainly were around at approximately the same time. And as you'll see from the family tree, Payank was the father of Painegem I, who was the father of three chief priests, Masahata, Jedkonsu, Uf Ankh, Menkhepera. And Menkhepera was the father of Nezubar-Nebjed, Smendes II, father of Painegem II, who was father of Parsib-Khan-Nut II, Susenes II. We have this clear continuity in the Payank family. The Lepsius expedition, which visited Egypt in the 1840s, visited the Temple of Khonsu, and a number of sons of Herihor crop up in the decoration of the Khonsu temple. I'm sorry, I don't have a photograph here. And these sons are named in the reliefs, and one of them was identified as an individual with the name Payank. So it was thought at the time, well, there we go, there's the proof. The chief priest of Amun, Payank, was a son of Herihor and inherited all of these titles from his father. Easy. Unfortunately, the name was misread. That son's name, in fact, was Ankhefen-Mut. So there is no such connection with Payank at all. So that idea that we've got a case of father passing things on to son doesn't work anymore. And in fact, there are other sort of slightly tricky issues with this reconstruction. An oracle mentions Payank in the year 7 of Wehem Mezut. So that's fairly early on in the Wehem Mezut period. And we know that in year 10, Payank led an army to Nubia to meet Parnexi. It's clear in that case that it was Payank. So in that case, Payank must have taken over from Herihor, probably no later than year 7 Wehem Mezut. But if that's right, then Herihor, with his appearance in the temple and his enclosure of his name in a cartouche, etc., takes place, and while Ramesses XI is still on the throne, and that would make him a kind of usurper, which doesn't sit entirely comfortably. There is, in fact, though, a different explanation, and that is that we switch the two of them round. So Payank comes first, In that instance, in that case, Payank is the general who was dispatched by Ramses the 11th to meet Parnexi. It's Payank's actions that inaugurates Wehem Mesut. And then Herihor comes afterwards, and only perhaps begins to adopt the trappings of kingship after the point at which Ramses XI had died, and we've got a new arrangement with kings in the north and priest kings in the south. The problem with that is that we then have to see Herihor as having interrupted the family sequence. So Payank passes his titles to the completely unrelated Herihor, and Herihor then passes his titles on to Payank's son, Painegem II. So neither of these solutions quite works, but for my money, and I think this is becoming the scholarly consensus as well, it is a better fit with the evidence to think that Payank came first for these reasons. The titles that Payank held altogether don't fit well with the later chief priests, but Herihor's do. They look much more like a continuity. Herihor and Painegem, the son of Payank, were both builders in Thebes, and Painegem succeeded Herihor directly in decorating the temple of Khonsu at Karnak. Every single one of the chief priests of Dynasty 21, including Herihor, are mentioned at some point on shrouds, bandages, etc., of royal mummies as part of the cashing process, which we know was underway in this period. Payank doesn't. So if he comes after Herihor, we'd have to imagine that there's a sudden strange gap during his time when there was no cashing, no restoration. Not impossible, but that bit less likely. And perhaps most importantly of all, Payank never claimed any royal attributes at all, doesn't write his name in a cartouche, doesn't have himself shown in close communion with the gods, doesn't depict himself in temple reliefs. Herihor did, Painegem did, and Painegem's son Menkaperad did as well. So again, there's that continuity there. And for me, I think this is the clincher. That declaration of some sort of kingship only occurs once the 20th dynasty is over and we've got a brand new situation with Smendes I in the north and priest kings in the south. It can only happen once the last king of Upper and Lower Egypt of the 20th dynasty, Ramses XI, has died. As I say, people are still arguing about this, but there we are. So this kingship is important, and as I say, Herihor and co, to my knowledge, and I must admit, actually, I haven't had a chance to check the corpus of 21st dynasty inscriptions published by Carl Janssen Winkhelm a few years ago, but certainly for the most part, I think it's fair to say the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt is not used by the priest kings, and indeed the word Nesu, king, is not used by them either. So as I said earlier, it's as though superficially they do everything to make themselves appear as though they're kings. They just don't use that specific title. So what of the other chief priests of Amun, the other priest kings? Oh, my presentation, I'm sorry, is being a bit slow to load. It does this every so often in Zoom. Strange. Forgive me. So the first of the chief priests of Amun, following Payank and Herihor, is Pinugem I, who in fact adopts a prenomen, a coronation name, as a good king would. That's taking things perhaps a step further. He is Karkhepera Pinugem I, Merry Amun, beloved of Amun, a son of Payank, and his coffin and mummy were discovered in TT 320, the royal cache. In fact, he was buried in coffins which probably originally belonged to Thutmose I of the 18th dynasty, but they were recycled for his burial. So no question about where he eventually ended up. Even if 320 was not his original tomb, we at least have his burial. Painegem I has 3 sons, all of whom became chief priest. And in fact, it's perhaps the case that, and again, we can't know this for sure, but that it was perhaps the case that at the point at which a chief priest ascends to the level of a kind of quasi-king, they appoint a new chief priest to act alongside them. That's the view of some of the scholars. So at the point at which Painarjem takes on royal attributes, he appoints a son, the first of whom was Masahata, to operate as chief priest. And this, incidentally, again, we can't say this for sure because we don't have enough information about the dates and we don't see them side by side. So we can't be absolutely clear about this. But it does echo the situation that we see later in the period in the 22nd dynasty, when recurringly the kings in the north would appoint a son to take on the office of chief priest of Amun at Thebes. The same thing is happening in the later Libyan period. It also happens in the 25th dynasty. The office of chief priest more or less disappears after the 25th dynasty, but we see it throughout this period. It seems to be a way for, certainly in later times, for the kings to ensure a control of the temple and the south by extension. So it would make sense perhaps that this is what's happening during Dynasty 21. So Painarjem the first, chief priest and priest king, is succeeded by Masahata, the very shortly reigning, if that's the right word. They had a very brief term in office. Jed Konsu Uf Ankh, and then finally Menkhepera. So this is Masahata. He's another of the individuals who turned up in the royal cache, looking a little bit bloated. I hope he wouldn't mind me saying, but this is to do with the fact that mummification by this point involves a lot of packing of the soft tissue to prevent it sort of collapsing in on the bones underneath. Sometimes successful, I think, and sometimes not so much. Anyway, his coffin and mummy turned up in the royal cache. He did not enclose his name in a cartouche at any point, but he nonetheless holds this string of titles, which most importantly include Chief Priest of Amun and Commander of the armies. Jed Konsu Uf Ankh is another son of Painarjem I. We know almost nothing about him, and in fact, there's only one piece of evidence to suggest that he became Chief Priest of Amun, which is a mention on a coffin, which has subsequently disappeared. So there's no suggestion that he didn't hold office, but if he did, it seems he didn't perhaps hold that office for very long. There is a suggestion, another of these snatches of evidence from a late Ramesside letter, that Masahata may have died of some kind of illness, perhaps prematurely, and that also this may have afflicted Jed Konsu Uf Ankh not long afterwards, which would explain perhaps why he wasn't chief priest for very long. In any case, at around this time, there seems to have been some kind of a rebellion or civil unrest in Thebes, which prompted the next in line, another brother, Menkhepera, to journey from the frontier region. He was based at El Hiba as an army commander at this point. He had an army, so he led his troops from El Hiba in the north to Thebes to end this unrest, whatever the nature of that was. And that is recorded on the stela, which is on the left-hand side here, which is called the Banishment Stela. It's now in the Louvre. Louvre E7822, Stèle du Bannissement. As a part of this, eventually Menkhepera becomes installed as the chief priest. It seems the office was vacant. He became chief priest in succession to his brothers, and eventually the transgressors, it seems, were pardoned. And Menkhepera is the last in this sequence to adopt any of the trappings of kingship. He did this only sporadically. He did enclose his name in a cartouche. It's his name that's in the top of the upper of the two cartouches here, Menkhepera, and then following Herihor, the phrase which is in the cartouche underneath is just Hemnecha Tepen Iman, chief priest of Amun. So a little bit as though, you know, he's using his principal title as a kind of coronation name, or just a way of writing a part of his name and titulary without going so far as to have a coronation name. So it's not really clear whether Men-Kheper thought of himself as a kind of priest king to the same extent as Herihor and Pi-Negem before him, but nonetheless he adopted some of these trappings. Following his time, the remaining chief priests of the period continued to operate as chief priests and also army commanders, but never adopting any of those trappings of kingship. So we have Smendes II, Nezubar-Nebjed II, who was a son of Men-Kheper, Pi-Negem, who was another son of Men-Kheper. He and a number of his family members were buried in the royal cache. And in fact, those of you who are at my talk will remember that on the subject will remember that there are two graffiti just at the entrance to the first of the passages in TT 320. One relating to the burial of Pi-Negem II's wife, and one to the burial of Pi-Negem II himself. So although many people argue that the tomb itself was considerably older, perhaps an early 18th dynasty tomb, at this point, before it became a cache tomb, Pi-Negem decided that this would be the tomb for himself and his family. And although we can't be sure about this because the records of the disposition of the coffins in the tomb are so terrible or pretty much non-existent, it seems most likely that the burial chamber, the final part of the architecture of the royal cache tomb, is the place where Pi-Negem II and his family were laid to rest. So essentially the royal cache was before it became a cache, it was their tomb. It was only afterwards that all these other coffins were introduced. So his burial place and the place of his successors and his family members, some of his successors and family members is well known. Finally, we have Parseb Khan Newt II. Parseb Khan Newt II/3, in fact, who was chief priest of Amun, but also most probably one and the same individual as the Tanite king Susenes II. If that interpretation is correct, and this son of Pi-Negem became both chief priest in the south and king in the north, then at this point the two lines are reunited, and that would set the stage for the end of the dynasty, beginning of the 22nd, when we have a unified Egypt. One of the difficulties here is that the Parseb Khan Newt II or third, this individual, the son of Pi-Negem, as chief priest, never declared himself king. So it's possible to argue that you've got two different individuals, a Tanite king and a chief priest. But most people would tell you they're the same, they're one and the same. So there we are. We have essentially three individuals who declare themselves kind of a priest king. Herihor was the first of them, regardless of whether he came before or after Pi-Negem II, and then Men-Kheper here. So this, I think it's worth just having a look at, what it is that makes a king, what goes into making a king of Egypt, and to what extent it's appropriate for us to refer to these chief priests as priest kings or southern kings. So I thought it would just be worth just having a look at some of the things that seem to me are sort of essential. So one of them is titulary, and as I mentioned before, the title more than any other, which is a signifier of the king of Egypt, pharaoh of Egypt, is this one here. This is incidentally, this is a relief of Tutankhamun from a temple of his now dismantled. It's on a block which is in the blockyard in between in the sort of southern portion of the Amun complex at Karnak. Very fine relief, actually. And these four signs altogether are the signs we read as, in transliteration, Nesu Biti, in translation, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, or perhaps dual king. Sometimes people prefer that. Well, you more commonly see King of Upper and Lower Egypt. The two signs along the bottom, the two semicircular signs, are just T phonetic signs. The signs above are, on the right, in this case, a sedge plant, which we read as Nesu, the word for king, and the B, this is a B, is the bitty part of the name. And in some cases, the sedge sign can stand on its own and just have the meaning of king, but not king of Upper and Lower Egypt. And that, in fact, is what we see later on in the Third Intermediate Period with the triumphal stela of P, or Pianki, the 25th Dynasty king. Excuse me, bit of cold coffee. So this, you may recall seeing this drawing. I've probably used this image more than any other I've ever used in lectures. This is Pianki, the Kushite 25th Dynasty king. Behind him is a seated Amun, twin plumes. This is Amun's consort Mut, wearing, interestingly enough, a double crown. And on either side of the lunette, we have a series of figures, most of them bowing down and kissing the ground before Pianki. So there's 5 of them over here, 3 of them here, and then another 2 figures, both of them raising their arms in a gesture of homage to the king. So this is Pianki, P, who, according to the label text here, is Nesubiti Sa-Ra Pianki. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the son of the sun god Ra, Pianki. And you might notice that all of these figures on this side, or at least this guy here standing, this is his wife behind him, and then all of these 3 here, they all have their names written in cartouches, actually. And you might just about be able to see that there are 2 signs before each of those cartouches. Again, it's the sedge plant with a T underneath. So we have the king of Upper and Lower Egypt here, the main man, and then some ordinary kings around him. They're not the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, they're just kings, but they still get to write their names in cartouches. Over on this side, we have people who are apparently of equivalent sort of status. They're bowing down and kissing the ground in exactly the same way as these kings are over here, but none of them uses the title king. They are mostly great chiefs or foremost ones, that kind of thing. Titles such as Hatiar, which are translated as mayor, sometimes, that kind of thing. They're local rulers, in other words. So, and we know from the Stela text that what happened at a certain point in the late 8th century BC is that Pianki arrived in Egypt to quell a rebellion led by Tefnach, the chief of the West, not a king himself. He doesn't appear here either. And he tells us that there are all these local rulers who are in rebellion against him up and down the Nile Valley and in the Delta, and he tells us where they were. Some of them are kings, some of them weren't. And what we understand from that is that being king doesn't really mean that much at this point. You can be the chief of this place, or you can be the governor of that place, or you can be the king of that place. It doesn't matter. You have equivalent authority and power in your own little local area. The thing that really matters is being king of Upper and Lower Egypt, and that makes you the overlord of everyone, the most important power, and that is Pianki. And so, I think it's important when we think about titles to remember that the priest kings never claimed that title. They adopt some of the trappings of a kind of kingship, but to me, this makes them kind of local rulers. And of course, we know Egypt is split at this point. They're not laying claim to rule of the whole country. Regalia and iconography is important, of course. Enclosing a name in a cartouche is a part of that. It's perhaps not really regalia or iconography, but it's a part of the way that you present yourself as a king or a quasi kind of royal individual. This relief actually tells us a great deal about Herihor's claim. We've already talked about his position vis-a-vis the god being the position normally occupied by a king. The fact that he's able to decorate a temple, that's normally the prerogative of a king. So, he's certainly walking the walk in those respects. And then, of course, control of government institutions in more normal times. With a centralized Egypt, it would be the king who was at the head of the temple, the king who was the head of the army, the head of the judiciary, etc., etc. In a divided Egypt, there needs to be somebody else who's nonetheless in control of those very practical, real world institutions. As we've seen, the chief priests throughout the period are in charge not only of the temple and everything that involves, but also the armies. In fact, the person who probably holds the greatest range of titles of all of this line is actually Payank, who never did claim the kingship, as we've seen. He was not only chief priest and army commander, but he was also vizier. He, as I mentioned, took on the position of viceroy of Nubia. He was the overseer of the granaries as well. So he really has the full range of titles. And in that regard, he's as much a king or a figure of equivalent authority as any of the others. Finally, and in some ways, perhaps the thing that preoccupies historians of this period more than any other, there's the question of regnal dates. We know that the Egyptian dating system is that events are dated according to the reign of the incumbent king. So such and such a thing will have happened in year such and such of the reign of king such and such. That is what makes the end of the New Kingdom so extraordinary, because we have a new dateline that doesn't follow that procedure, the Wehem Mezut era, in which events are dated to that period rather than to the reign of a king. But we've also got the added complication that around this time, the late 20th dynasty into the 21st, Theban datelines, inscriptions from Thebes or surrounding area, which give dates, never refer to the Tanite king that they relate to. They're generally presumed, however, to relate to Tanite kings. It's just that the name isn't mentioned. So typically you get inscriptions that will say year 6 or year 10, but it doesn't tell us year 10 of who or of what. So when we see a year date, year 6, year 10, scholars usually, by comparison with other sources, have a way of deciding which of the Tanite kings these relate to. And some of those Tanite kings didn't reign for very long. So if you have quite a high date, in the teens or into the 20s, then it can only have been a date relating to a king who reigned for that sort of period of time. So it couldn't possibly be Azorkon the Elder, who it seems only reigned for a year or two at most. But it has been suggested by other scholars that these may actually relate to the reigns of the priest kings, but that perhaps the priest kings didn't feel secure enough in their kingship to say, to have their names mentioned in these date lines. So, perhaps the anonymity is related to the fact that there wasn't quite the comfort about adopting this aspect of kingship. So, and that, of course, leaves us in the dark as well. Scholars can't be absolutely sure when you've got an inscription that's dated year 1 or year 6 or year 2. Does it relate to a Tanite king? If so, which of those Tanite kings? And that has a bearing on when in history that particular thing happened. Or does it relate to Theban kings? And if it does relate to Theban kings, then that, I think, changes our understanding of the nature of the rule of Herihor and co, particularly vis-a-vis their relationship with their counterparts in Tanis. That was all a bit complicated, wasn't it? Why don't we have a look at tombs? I always feel more comfortable looking for tombs. So part of the reason for looking into the extent to which Herihor and co were kings is that it has informed discussion about these tombs. We know from particularly the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, the intact tomb of Tutankhamun, and to a certain extent as well from what we know from the discovery of the intact tombs of the 21st dynasty kings in Tanis. We have the burials of a number of 21st and 22nd dynasty kings at that site, and they were shown to have been buried with considerable quantities of precious materials, gold and silver, etc. Some very, very fine objects. If we are to see Herihor and co as kings, people who are on that level, then we might expect them to have been buried with spectacular grave goods. And you could argue that anybody of high status would probably be buried with some quite nice things. But I think the idea that Herihor is a king kind of just elevates what some people might be expecting of the tomb. And in fact, one Egyptologist in particular, John Romer, who's got a real a gift for communicating with large audiences and a great way with words, has suggested that if the tomb of Herihor were to be found, and if it were intact, as he argues it will be, it would be a tomb to make Tutankhamun look like Woolworths. Maybe a slightly outdated way of describing it now that Woolworths doesn't exist in the UK anymore, but I'm sure you all know what he's getting at here. It would really put Tutankhamun's burial equipment in the shade. Seems a bit unlikely given just exactly how spectacular the Tutankhamun treasures were, but still, it's a good way of generating excitement and interest in this. And that phrase actually comes from a documentary that Romer was in, I think at the very beginning of the 1980s, called Romer's Egypt, which follows his fieldwork in Thebes, his excavation of the tomb of Ramesses XI, the last tomb to be cut in the Valley of the Kings. It was never used, incidentally, for the burial of the last king of the 20th dynasty, but it was built and it was decorated, and it contained some interesting material. He also follows his search for the tomb of Herihor in the Western Wadis, which we're going to be exploring in just a little while. And that was quite a long time ago, early 1980s. He discussed the issues further in a couple of books of his, on the Valley of the Kings and the Deir el-Medina workmen. But actually the story has continued in circulation. And I started writing my book on lost tombs in 2014, and that same year, the story hit the news again. So this is an online article in the Times, in which Romer is quoted as saying he believes the West Bank contains the burial site of 3 priest kings, Herihor, Payank, and Menkaperah. So 3 of the conspicuous gaps in our record of the tombs. And in the same year, in fact, elsewhere, this is the website of Radio Poland. I don't know how familiar you are with that site, that purveyor of news. But this talks about another colleague of mine, Professor Andrzej Nowinski, another very good Egyptologist, who was involved in fieldwork, still is involved in archaeological fieldwork at Deir el-Bahari, in the cliffs behind the Temple of Hatshepsut. And, he is very keen on the idea that there's good reason to think that the tomb of Herihor might be at his site. And he's reported here as believing that the supposedly intact tomb will bear, at the very least, the mummy of Herihor adorned with a gold mask and jewelry. So whatever you think of the credibility of these theories or these projects, these are 2 highly regarded Egyptologists who at one time or another, if not currently, have held important concessions to undertake fieldwork in Egypt. And the story still has traction in the media. So for this reason, I thought it was worth looking at in my book, and I think it's worth us looking at it here too. John Romer in particular was drawing on a body of evidence gathered together by probably the most famous archaeologist ever to work in Egypt, of course, Howard Carter, who we see in the photograph at the right-hand side here. In October 1916, a few years before he discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, he was actually on holiday. He was in Luxor. He'd lived there for many years. He was taking a break when it was made known to him that a discovery had been made in what he described as a lonely and unfrequented region. A tomb had been found by a group of locals, but they had subsequently been driven away by a rival group, leading to all sorts of problems among the villagers. And Carter was asked to intervene, to go and try and establish what was there, what had happened, and try and sort things out and break the fight up. So he gathered together the workmen that he could and set off more or less immediately. It's quite a long journey from where he was into the desert wadis. So he set off during daylight, but completed his journey in the middle of the night by moonlight, so he tells us. My slides are taking a long time to load. Here we go. This is what he found. In fact, I think we've missed a quote. Yeah, here we go. So this is what he described as this is how he described the situation when he arrived. He says, it was midnight when we arrived on the scene, and the guide pointed out to me the end of a rope which dangled sheer down the face of the cliff. Listening, we could hear the robbers actually at work. So I first severed their rope, thereby cutting off their means of escape, and then, making secure a good stout rope of my own, I lowered myself down the cliff. Shinning down a rope at midnight into a nestful of industrious tomb robbers is a pastime which at least does not lack excitement. I love his understatement. So he was approximately here. He was led to this spot here. And this is his section drawing of the area, and he's included a little human figure here to give an idea of scale. So his rope was sent down the face of the cliff this way. He would have had to lower himself down this sheer cliff face like this, and then there is an opening and cutting in the rock here, leading to a gently sloping passageway and a tomb. And as you will perhaps notice from the labeling on the diagram, and also the title of the article from which this drawing is taken, he had discovered a tomb prepared for Queen Hatshepsut. So this is Hatshepsut, the famous Hatshepsut who became pharaoh during the reign of Thutmose III as a usurper. This tomb was being prepared at a point prior to her becoming pharaoh. So she was never buried here. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings, of course, as a pharaoh. But before that point, she was the queen of Thutmose II, and would have been had a reasonably spectacular tomb prepared for herself on that basis, all the way out here in the Western Wadis. It wasn't an enormous or very complicated tomb, but clearly it was a very considerable effort to cut any kind of tomb into this situation halfway up a sheer cliff face. And it's quite a staggering achievement to think that the robbers found this tomb at all, but even more astonishing to think that the ancients managed to cut a tomb and also to maneuver into it a sarcophagus, which we see here in chamber E, which appears to have been the main burial chamber. Here we can see the tomb in plan. So the face of the cliff, as it says, is up here. There's a short staircase, then passageway which takes the right angle turn, arrives in a roughly square burial chamber with the sarcophagus in the center. This is that sarcophagus, which is now on display, or at least it was the last time I looked, in the central atrium in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square. Clearly prepared for Hatshepsut as queen rather than as pharaoh. And that was interesting enough in itself, of course, although there was very little to find in the tomb, the sarcophagus and then just a couple of jars, not much more. But what was really of much more interest to Carter was the possibility, having discovered and established that there was an important tomb in this area, that there might be more to find. So he undertook a survey in what remained of 1916 and into 1917, and produced this sketch map of the area. This is now in the Griffith Institute at the University of Oxford, and it's reproduced in Piers Litherland's book, The Western Wadis of the Theban Necropolis. This is the area in question. It's approximately sort of here. So to orient us, the more familiar part of the Theban necropolis is in this, in this sort of area here. So this is the Temple of Hatshepsut. This is the roadway leading up to that temple. The Ramesseum is here. The tombs of the nobles are so-called, are in this sort of area. And the Valley of the Kings is just behind the Temple of Hatshepsut. This is the main branch of the valley here, which is accessed via the road. And this is the Western Valley, where we find the tomb of I and the tomb of Amenhotep III. So the Western Wadis are over here, and Carter would have accessed them probably from around the point of Medina Habu, which is here. He would have journeyed across the desert and entered the Wadis from this point. And when he made his survey, he identified half a dozen or so areas of particular interest, which he labelled A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Essentially, the area. Oh, come on! My slides are being really slow to load. I don't know if this is PowerPoint or a Zoom. It's very annoying. Here we go. There are two wadis essentially here. One of them on the left, if you like, the Wadi El Gharbi, which takes this route approximately. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying here with my straight lines. And the Wadi El Gharbi is this means Wadi of the south, and the Wadi Gabanat El Karud, which is this one here, which means the Wadi of the Cemetery of the Apes, because a number of ape burials were found here at the beginning of the 20th century by French excavators Gorton and Laurie and Gaillard, I think the names were. The other areas of interest are essentially side wadis leading off these main two. So A, the Wadi Siket Taket Zaid leads off here. Then we have B, C, E and G lead off the main branch of the Wadi El Gharbi, which terminates in F up at the top there. And Carter observed lots of interest, numerous tombs concentrated in the least accessible or visible spots, specifically clefts and crevices in the cliffs. So it's clear that the activity was focused on spots in the wadis which were very, very well concealed. So there was a clear intention to ensure that tombs could be built in this area in such a way that they would be very difficult to find, let alone violate. He also found ancient pathways, groups of stone huts, graffiti, all additional evidence of human activity of one kind or another, important in itself, given how far distant this was away from anything. Worked material, including chippings, heaps of chipped fragments of the natural rock in the area, but also of stone which had been brought in from elsewhere: granite, basalt, crystalline sandstone, and alabaster. So to look at these areas in turn, Wadi A also has the local name Wadi Siket Taket Zaid, the Wadi or valley of the window of Zaid, one of the tombs which is anonymous, found to contain nothing but cut into the cliffs, has a chamber which then itself has a kind of opening onto the Wadi, a kind of a window, hence the window in the name. Carter said, at its head, hidden in the cliffs, are 4 tombs. 2 are pit tombs, one a sort of corridor tomb, now known as the Barrés tomb, after Émile Barrés, who subsequently investigated this, and one a cliff tomb in the face of the rock, and that is the tomb of Hatshepsut, which he'd discovered at the outset of his work here. He found further pit tombs close to the entrance of the wadi. So these would be very simple pits in the ground, not rock-cut tombs in the sense of the Hatshepsut tomb and the Barrés tomb as well. He also found graffiti close to the tomb of Hatshepsut, including several relating to the scribe of the necropolis, Amun, scribe of the tomb, Amun, who's a very important figure in the late 20th dynasty, early 21st dynasty, very heavily involved in the process of inspections of tombs, renewal of tombs, restorations, and ultimately perhaps a little bit more. We'll look at him in a bit more detail in a second. One of these graffiti, which is dated to year 12, apparently of Smendes I, also mentions a son of Amun, Ankef Enamun, and the inscription says that they spent 2 consecutive days in the mountains in order to see them. Little bit vague, but probably conveying the sense of a tomb inspection. As I say, they were Amun, his father, his descendants as well, his sons, heavily involved in this process of inspection. The tomb robberies of the 20th dynasty and perhaps later prompted repeated inspections of tombs to make sure that they were intact, and when they were found to have been violated, to initiate proceedings to try and find the robbers. And we know from the tomb robbery papyri that a number of robbers were often caught and then punished. And also, where tombs have been found to be violated, the bodies of the kings often needed rewrapping, or they needed new coffins. And Dr Hammond was absolutely at the center of all of these processes. So we know he was involved in inspections, so restorations, and as I say, as things go on, perhaps a little bit more. In any case, it's important evidence of activity at approximately the time of Herihor. So for our purposes here, this is important. This is a photograph from Litherland's western wadis of the Theban necropolis, showing the lie of the land. So the tombs labeled 23 and 20 here are pit tombs. The two rather more important ones are 22, which is the tomb of Hatshepsut, and 21, the so-called Barre's tomb. So you get a sense from this photograph of just exactly how difficult it would be to get to the Hatshepsut tomb. You either go down from the cliff top via a rope, or you'd have a devil of a job climbing up from the valley floor. You'd have a devil of a job just to get to this point up here. It's not exactly an easy place to get to. And then the opening is halfway up this sheer cliff face. And the same, you have the same situation roughly with the Barre's tomb here as well. Very, very difficult to access. Wadi C contained pit tombs and one very substantial cliff tomb in a fissure below a watercourse, basically following the model of the Wadi A tombs. And nearby, on a large block of fallen limestone, Carter observed a graffito, which is essentially a cartouche containing signs which he read altogether as the name Neferu Re. And Neferu Re was one of the daughters of Hatshepsut. So Carter's guess was that this related to the cliff tomb that he'd found, which, although there was no other evidence to support this idea, he believed to be the tomb of Princess Neferu Re, and that interpretation has generally come to be accepted in the absence of any evidence to the contrary. So it looks like we perhaps have another tomb of a royal woman in the area. And this is his sketch of that tomb. Again, it's a right-turning tomb, which seems to be a characteristic feature of tombs of royal women of the period. Wadi D, or area D, which is the terminus of the Wadi Gabanat El Karud. This is where Lorte and Gaillard, as I mentioned, found the remains of numerous baboons. It's also found to be a place where there were numerous late 20th and early 21st dynasty graffiti, again mentioning this important scribe, Dr Hammond. And it was also the location of what has come to be known as the tomb of the 3 foreign wives of Thutmose III. These are two views of Wadi D, or area D, the one on the left looking towards the end of the wadi, and the one on the right looking back out from the end of the wadi. And this is where this tomb of 3 foreign wives was discovered. This is, again, a very similar situation to the Hatshepsut and Barre's and Neferu Re tombs. The ancients seems to have made use of this natural cleft or sort of crevice in the rock, and then cut into it at a certain point, some way above the wadi floor level. So you can see there's a very long ladder positioned here, providing access to a Metropolitan Museum of Art expedition that worked here in the 80s or 90s. I think that's where this photograph comes from, the resulting publication. This tomb, in fact, had been discovered slightly earlier in the same year as Carter was taken to the tomb of Hatshepsut, 1916. It was discovered in July, but it was kept quiet at the time. It was discovered by locals and found to contain some extremely spectacular objects. So rather than let everybody know what they'd found, they kept it quiet and slowly passed the objects onto the antiquities market, so as to make a bit of money without arousing the suspicions of the pesky archaeologists. The result of this is that knowledge of this important discovery actually was rather, well, it's non-existent to begin with, and rather scant thereafter. And the situation in the tomb had to be pieced together retrospectively, in fact by Carter, who went around the local dealers attempting to retrospectively regather together all of the material. And from this, it became clear what the tomb was. So this is a plan. Actually, it's from the Metropolitan publication, but revised by Litherland and Co. to make it slightly clearer. So this is the wadi floor. There's actually another pit tomb over here, a couple of graffiti, another one here. And then this halfway up the cliff is the entrance to a sort of level platform area, almost kind of corridor leading into the rock via this natural crevice. And then this is the artificially cut tomb. So the leveled area leads to a short descending staircase, then another right turn, and then a gently sloping passageway leading to a single burial chamber. So again, this is the ladder leading up to that crevice here, and then this is the leveled area. So you're walking into the natural crevice in the cliff here, and this leads to a sort of slightly larger opening, and then the tomb proper begins here. And this is a section drawing showing the descending slope and the tomb chamber. So as I say, these objects were all dispersed, but then gathered together again by Carter and Co. And eventually most of them made their way via Carter to the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, New York. So thankfully they're in a public collection now, and many of them on display and eminently accessible via the Met's brilliant website. They turned out to be objects inscribed for 3 women, Menhet, Menwi, and Merthi, all wives of Thutmose III. And their names give away the fact they were not Egyptian. These were foreign names, and we think that they were probably daughters of Syrian chieftains married to Thutmose III as part of a kind of marriage alliance between the Egyptian king and these overseas kinglets. And the objects really are sensational. They include this headdress composed of a single gold plate at the top and then gold rosettes inlaid with carnelian, turquoise and glass. This collar with falcon head terminals. This lovely bracelet, which has 3 recumbent cats on it, 2 in gold, 1 in carnelian, and emplacements for 2 more cats now missing. Incredible Hathor head mirror. And this lovely silver vessel inscribed for Manuwai. So really, really lovely things. This is just a tiny selection of the things that were found. So incredibly, the tomb, it seems, was actually intact. It had been badly damaged by water, but otherwise it was intact. It had survived, never been robbed. So in fact, it seems the ancients, in placing the tomb where they did, in this distant wadi, making it very difficult to access, had done their job in keeping it secure. So there we are. That is the location of the tomb of the 3 foreign wives of Thutmose III. So again, altogether, so far, we now have several tombs belonging to royal women of the 18th dynasty. We're next going to look at Wadi El Gharbi, which is the southern of the 2 main wadis here, and specifically at the last stretch of it, which is Carter's Area F. He says of Wadi F, or Area F, at the beginning of this canyon, among great fallen blocks of limestone are heaps of debris, stone chippings from some ancient excavation. On the right as you enter is a small lateral valley containing stone huts of workmen, pottery and various graffiti. Above the cascade are more heaps of ancient origin, and upon the larger limestone fragments fallen from the cliffs are numerous hieratic inscriptions, such as also occur at the bases of the cliffs themselves. Further pit tombs are close to the entrance of the wadi. So this is the Wadi El Gharbi, in fact, looking out from the end of it back towards the Nile Valley in the direction of Medinet Habu. You can't really see the Nile Valley below, but you probably get a sense of just how far distant we are from civilization here. He goes on, the graffiti and heaps of rubbish indicate the presence of tombs in the vicinity, as the natives have recognized, but the extensive excavations made by them have apparently been without result. As the Wadi El Gharbi is far away and difficult to protect against depredations, I'm making more extensive soundings here in the hope of revealing lost tombs. I have already found a piece of crystalline sandstone from a sarcophagus, the projection for levers used in transportation. So Carter clearly believed that there were more tombs to find here, as he knew did the villagers, and yet they had not found anything, and in fact neither did he. And that is partly, of course, what's driving John Romer and others to think that there may yet be something very exciting to be found here. The graffiti, as we've already seen, are frequently inscribed by Jehutimos, who was the father of Butahamen and Butahamen himself, and also others involved in the restoration of burials at around this time. They also occasionally include royal names, these inscriptions, and the name that crops up in that context more than any other is the name of Herihor, particularly in Area F of the Wadi El Gharbi. Another aspect of these inscriptions, which is very common, is what's been interpreted to be a kind of tomb sign. This is a roughly sort of T-shaped sign that we see highlighted here. It doesn't appear in pink naturally. It's highlighted by in the Litherland volume to make it easier to see. Sort of scratched into the surface of the rock, it's thought to represent the plan of a tomb, or the basic plan of a tomb. And these are everywhere. So again, more evidence perhaps that we have tombs here somewhere. Butahamen, as I've said, was scribe of the tomb. He held various other titles, including opener of the gates of the necropolis, or opener of the gates of the underworld, overseer of works in the House of Eternity. House of Eternity is an Egyptian phrase meaning tomb or perhaps burial chamber. His name crops up in association with the restoration of the mummy of Ramesses III, and his coffin is the one on the left here, although some people actually believe that this coffin is too late to belong to our Butahamen, the Butahamen of the late New Kingdom, early 21st Dynasty. But ignoring those concerns for a second, if it is his coffin, then it's also significant perhaps that it features a number of royal ancestors in the decoration, which again sort of emphasizes this idea of Butahamen having been very closely involved with kings of the New Kingdom, specifically in the caching process, etc. And he, as his father had been, and others like him, were among the senior officials in the Deir el-Medina community, the community of workmen responsible for commissions, for communication with the higher authorities, the vizier and the court of the king, distribution of wages, etc., etc. So, you know, it's among the most important officials, certainly on the West Bank in Thebes at this time. He had a rather spectacular house, which has survived to some extent within the temple enclosure walls at Medina Habu. It's well worth visiting if you get a chance to go there. His father's house, the house of his father Jehutimos, is almost certainly here too, although that hasn't been certainly identified, but a number of his letters were found here. So it seems very likely that he was present as well. One of the letters in the late Ramesside letters corpus is significant. Actually, this is one that I quoted in my lecture on royal mummies not long ago. This is the letter which has been interpreted to signify a change in the nature of the work that people like Butahamen were undertaking. This is a letter from Butahamen to Paryank, who at this point was away in Nubia at the time of his meeting with Parnexi. And it says, "We have noted everything about which our master has written to us, namely," so this following section is the command sent to them by Paryank. Paryank said, "Go and perform for me a task on which you have never before embarked, and search for it until I come to you. So says our Lord." And he goes on, "Uncover a tomb among the tombs of the ancestors and preserve its seal until I return." A little bit convoluted, as these things often are, but the thrust of this is that Paryank is asking Butahamen and co to do something they've never done before. Go and find a tomb among the tombs of the ancestors, that's a tomb among the kings, and preserve its seal. So go and find a tomb that is intact and wait for me. And it's not absolutely clear, but it has been interpreted to mean that Paryank now wants Butahamen and co to go to sealed tombs, wait for him, and that he will, with them, then open that tomb and strip them of the precious materials, so that the precious materials, the value in them could be returned to the Egyptian economy. Because as we know, there are problems with the Egyptian economy at this point. And also Paryank is engaged possibly in what's a kind of civil war, certainly with an army down in Nubia, with troops needing to be fed, etc., etc. So this is a very significant sort of moment, turning point, perhaps, the point at which we now believe inspections and restorations of burials turned into reclamation of precious materials. John Romer has argued for a long time, as we've seen, that the tomb of Herihor may lie in the Wadi el-Karbi, and that's based on the chippings, like those from work in the royal tombs, still covering much of the Great Place, he wrote at one point. The sarcophagus boss, the graffiti, Amun, Herihor, tomb signs, and also, as we've already said, the total absence of any funerary material belonging to Herihor and indeed to Paryank and Menkhepera, the other individuals who often come up in this idea about missing tombs. So, should we expect these things to survive? Just picking up on that last point, should we expect things to survive, or is it just that, sometimes we don't have stuff because it hasn't survived? Well, that's possible, but Romer and co would argue that actually, these are not just gaps; they are very conspicuous gaps because we have so much of the burials of the other kings and high-ranking individuals from this period. The two caches, TT320 and KV35, give us almost all the bodies, the mummies of the kings of the New Kingdom. Just across those two tombs, 320 and 35, we have all of these mummies, which leaves us with not really too many gaps. And actually, we can supplement the list with the mummies from KV55, KV62, Tutankhamun, and one or two others as well. And the same is true, in fact, for the chief priests of the 21st Dynasty, a number of whom, as we know, turned up in the royal cache. So we've already seen these are coffins of Penugem II. This is the mummy of Masahata. This is the mummy of Penugem II. So quite a lot of these individuals turned up there too. And if we think even further back, actually, we know that the high priest Amenhotep, who came into conflict with the viceroy of Nubia, Parneksi, we know that he was buried in a tomb now designated K93 1112 at Dra Abu al-Naga. Incidentally, those of you who saw my talk on the lost tomb of Amenhotep I will know that this is a candidate for that tomb. But whether or not it was originally cut in the early 18th dynasty for a pharaoh like Amenhotep I, it was certainly reused at the end of the 20th for Amenhotep. So he's somebody else who we can account for. The same is true, actually, of the 21st dynasty kings in Tanis. We don't have all of their burials, but we do have those of Susenes I, Amenemope, Amun, and Susenes II. And it may well be that we only don't have the others because of all of the moving around of bodies and coffins and such, like in the 22nd dynasty, which is clear happened. They may yet be awaiting us in a different part of the Tanis necropolis, but it may just be that their bodies were lost as part of this movement. In any case, there's a lot that we do have. And in fact, then this really does only leave these few conspicuous gaps. Paryank, Herihor, Jed Konsu Uf Ang, about whom we know almost nothing. He's more or less ephemeral, and then Menkhepera. So let's just, I'm aware I'm overrunning, I'm very sorry. I always do this, but I'm not going to be too much longer. Let's just look at all this evidence. So we've got graffiti and tomb signs, worked material, chippings, workmen's huts. On the graffiti, I'm not persuaded by this myself. Let's look at one of these graffiti in rather more detail. This is one of the Wadi D graffiti, which was found near the tomb of the foreign wives. It reads, the royal scribe of the tomb, Jehutimos, his son, the scribe of the tomb, Amun, when he came to inspect in year 6, which I believe is year 6 of Smendes I, third month of Shomu, day 11, along with the chief workman Neb-Nefer and Amun Par-Nefer. The important word here is the Egyptian word seep, which has the meaning of inspect, when he came to inspect in year 6. This absolutely fits with this idea of tomb inspections. So Jehutimos, Amun and co are in this part of the world because they know that there are pre-existing, that is to say, 18th dynasty tombs in the area, which they were going to check on. That's why they were there. John Romer and others have argued that their presence in this area actually indicates that they were there looking for places to cut new tombs. I don't think the evidence supports that. There is another, much more, to my mind, credible explanation, which says these are the records of inspections. So they don't relate to tomb construction, they relate to inspections rather. So I think, for my money, the graffiti are not good evidence to suggest that the tomb of Herihor and co might be here. So I think actually we can discount the worked material, including the sarcophagus boss as well, because we know that there are tombs in the area. It's not as though this is an apparently barren area with suspicious tomb type activity. It's a cemetery area. We know that. It's just that it's a cemetery of, as far as the evidence goes, 18th dynasty queens. The chippings are maybe interesting, but actually the work of Piers Litherland and co, working for the New Kingdom Research Foundation, has established, or at least in the view of its geologists, the chippings are actually natural. They're not the product of somebody chiseling into the natural rock. They are simply the natural fragmentation of the local limestone. And in fact, the pathways, which John Romer and others have argued are the evidence of lots of activity in Wadi El Gharbi, they only connect with the high desert with difficulty, and what were thought to be areas for the storage of water, which you'd need if you were going to spend a long time in the area, are actually excavations for quartzite or gypsum, this kind of thing. So I'm not sure the chippings or the workmen's huts actually add up to much persuasive evidence either. More damningly, I'm afraid, some traces of the funerary equipment of Herihor and at least one of our other missing chief priest kings, Menkaperot, have in fact been found. So this is the most spectacular evidence we have. This is an armlet, an armband, inscribed for Herihor. You can't see the inscription because it's on the inside of the bracelet, but you can just about see traces of it here. The turquoise is inscribed with an image of Amun Min. You might just about be able to make out his twin plumes here. This came onto the art market, so we don't know where exactly it comes from. We have no provenance. Came onto the market in the 1980s, along with some other jewelry, which I've never been able to find anything out about. And it's now in the Roma Peretzeus Museum in Hildesheim in Germany. It seems most likely to me that this comes from a funerary context. It comes from a tomb, and most likely it comes from the tomb of Herihor. Given what we know about tombs and caches in the 21st dynasty, it's not impossible that Herihor's tomb, wherever he was initially buried, might have been visited and his body and funerary equipment moved to a cache somewhere. It could be that that cache is yet to be found, and that his body, etc., might yet be awaiting us, but that somehow or another this bracelet escaped from that context. In any case, I think it makes it much, much less likely that his original tomb is going to be found intact. The same is true for Menkaperot, in fact. Without too much ceremony, this was discovered a few years ago in Abydos, around 2009 to 11, by Egyptian-American team led by Ayman Damarani and Kevin Cahail. And this turns out to be a fragment of the red granite sarcophagus of the chief priest of Amun, priest king Menkaperot. It was found reused as part of the floor of the monastery of Apamoses in that area. We don't know where it came from. We'd expect, I think, Menkaperot to be buried in Thebes, but perhaps he was buried in Abydos. It's not clear. In any case, this is clearly his sarcophagus. So his tomb, it seems, is not going to be found intact either. Meanwhile, the New Kingdom Research Foundation, which began its work in the Western Wadis in 2013, and as far as I know is still going, has identified new tombs. They have found new tombs. It's just that it is all more material relating to the 18th dynasty and royal family members, particularly queens. So the project has found the burials of 2 wives, son of Amenhotep III, Amenhotep III's sister Tr, and at least 13 court women, as it says here. And they have rapidly published the results of their work. A first volume on the shaft tombs of Wadi Baria is already available. And indeed, it's significant, actually, that these tombs were not in Wadi al-Gharbi, where all of that activity, graffiti, etc., was found by Carter. It's off over here. The Wadi Baria is this very, very large, flat, sandy plain. And in fact, the pin is here so that I can show it on the map. Their site is actually a little off to the south and west. So that seems to be the place. And of course, that's just adding more to what we already knew about the Western Wadis, which is that they are a place for the burial of queens. So the 4 tomb plans, right-turning tomb plans that we see here in the diagrams. The one at the top left is actually not in the Western Wadis, it's in Deir al-Bahri, the tomb of Meriet Amun, who was the sister and wife of Amenhotep the first. But you can see, in general terms, it has a very similar layout to the tombs of Hatshepsut, the tomb of Neferu-Re, supposed, and the tomb of the 3 foreign wives of Thutmose III. So this just looks more and more like the Western Wadis were in use as 18th dynasty burial ground, and that would explain the presence of Jehutimos and Buta Amun there. And we still, despite all of this work, and the New Kingdom Research Foundation work seems to have been very thorough, we still don't have any clear evidence that there's any tomb building in the area other than at that time. And that, I think, means that we have very little to go on when it comes to looking for the tomb of Herihor in this area. So I'm afraid the search continues. And with that, and thanks for indulging me and letting me overrun as always, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you for listening. So those of you who are still here, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for coming. If you got any questions, do let me know via the Q&A. Any of you didn't catch me saying that. If you've got questions, there's a Q&A box in the navigation, your Zoom navigation. So click the Q&A button and pop your questions in there, and I'll do my best to answer them. So looks like there are a few questions. Lucas asked, not completely related, but I thought it was a fun question. Tomorrow you are appointed Chief of the Ministry of Antiquities. You have the power to select any site in Egypt to start an archaeological dig. Where do you first pick? Oh, well, actually, the first thing I want to do, which is not really digging, is to go to the spot in Alexandria where I think the a monument which has sometimes been called the Baths of Cleopatra in the past is to be found. That's not a tomb that would need to be discovered for the first time. I just want to know if it still exists, because I haven't been able to find anybody to tell me if it does or not, including Ministry of Antiquities inspectors in Alexandria who didn't know what I was talking about when I asked them. So the first thing I would want to do is to go and do that. And actually, I wouldn't need to be the Ministry of Antiquities to do that. I don't know when I'm going to be in Alexandria next, hopefully sometime next year, but I'm hoping to just jump in a taxi and see if I can peer over a wall and check to see if that's there. If we had to go and look for new tombs, I would say the North Saqqara Plateau in between the Step Pyramid and the Sacred Animal Necropolis, because there are certainly, beyond all doubt, very large tombs that have never been excavated in that area of the period of the Old Kingdom, possibly as old as the Third Dynasty, possibly as late as the 5th or 6th. But in any case, there would certainly be results, and it's an area where people have searched for the tomb of Imhotep. That's what I'm not saying, which would be very interesting. I think that would be a great place to look. Yeah. Gosh, that's a fun thought. Yeah, Leanne says, yeah, exactly, from last night's lecture. Yeah, so the Baths of Cleopatra were what I was talking about in for the Glen Ira libraries in Victoria, Australia yesterday. And yeah, the so-called Baths of Cleopatra, what survives of them actually is a very, very large and spectacular first century AD tomb of an anonymous individual or individuals. It seems to have just disappeared from the majority of people's minds. I think it survives, but I don't know. I'd just like to go and see. I wouldn't be at all surprised if, having got there, we find that there isn't anything actually to see, and that probably somebody needs to get some keys to open a gate and possibly a door, and that getting those keys or somebody to open them, somebody to open those gates and doors might be a bit difficult. But anyway, I haven't got there yet. I'll let you know if I do. And Martin says, would the population not revolt against the self-proclaimed ruler? After all, the pharaoh is the son of Horus, appointed by the gods. Well, I think, Martin, these kinds of episodes in Egyptian history bring into question the extent to which everything the pharaohs would have us believe about their divine authority and the significance of that. I think that sort of casts doubt on everything. I mean, on one end of things, you might say, well, the Egyptians were all incredibly pious and all swallowed every last aspect of religious belief and mythology that we've been able to uncover in excavations and in reading texts and things. And that at the other end of things, you might say, well, I mean, that's what they were supposed to believe, but how pious were they? I mean, did they really swallow everything whole, or did they find that at times there were little lapses in their religious beliefs? And of course, we've got lots of evidence that they weren't always acting entirely piously. And when it comes down to it, people in ancient Egypt, just like people anywhere, want to be paid their wages. They need to be able to eat and to feed their families, and they need security and not to be threatened by marauding Libyans. And if you've got somebody who comes along who's a military general who also happens to be the chief priest of Amun and says, "I'll don't worry, I'll sort things out for you," then you might well think, okay, fine, actually, I'd rather you did that than Pharaoh, who's been useless, hasn't paid us, never comes to see us, lives hundreds of miles away, don't really know who he is. Does he exist? Don't know. He's no use to me. I mean, it's also worth bearing in mind, I didn't really go into too much detail about this, but at this point in history, there is clearly a diminishing of the authority of the king. At the same time, the importance of Amun, and I mean, of course, Amun is in the New Kingdom is the most important of the Egyptians' gods, but if anything, he becomes more important in the 21st dynasty, and more decisions, more acts of the authorities are enacted on the basis of oracles of Amun. So where previously Pharaoh might decide to do something, I'm going to build a temple, I'm going to invade somebody else's country. In the 21st dynasty, from the 21st dynasty onwards, it would much more commonly be Amun saying, I'd like you to build me a temple, please, or I'd like us to invade a different country, please. And anybody then could enact those things. The point is, it's the will of Amun. So even if Pharaoh is a little bit sidelined and your orders start coming from somebody else, if that somebody else says, well, that's nothing to do with me, mate, actually Amun told me to do it, then it still sort of fits with the idea of religious belief and worship. I mean, another part of the answer to this is we just can't know what people were really thinking. We've only got tiny little scraps of evidence here and there, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch of the imagination to see that when things is tough, then your religious beliefs might take second place to just having a meal on the table. Maybe. Good question, though. Thanks. Lucas says, sorry for another question. Don't need to apologise. Lucas, just curious about the book you mentioned of 21st Dynasty inscriptions. What was it called again? I didn't tell you what it was called. It's called something very dry and boring, like Historische Inschriften der Dritten Zwischenzeit, Teil 1, die 21. Dynastie. It is the book I have in mind is entirely hieroglyphic transcriptions of ancient texts. So it's like a source book. There's a volume for the 21st Dynasty. There's a volume for 22nd and 23rd, and there's a volume for 25th, and there's a volume. I think there is now a volume for the 26th. But anyway, I quite often find myself wanting not to. I mean, I quite often find myself looking for translations of text. But given that translations are subjective, it's quite often useful to be able to just quickly check what an inscription says in the original Egyptian. So in fact, I was having a discussion in the questions yesterday evening with a friend and colleague of mine, David Roll, who contests the new interpretation of the order of Payank and Herihor, on the basis that the text on a papyrus in Russia, which we know is the report of Wen Amun, or the tale of Wen Amun, which features Herihor, is dated to year 5 Wehem Mezut. And I wanted to, but I wasn't able to check the Egyptian before I did the talk, and I couldn't be absolutely sure whether the text was dated year 5 Wehem Mezut or whether it was just year 5, in which case it could be Wehem Mezut, or it could be Smendes, or it could be Herihor, if you want to argue that. David's interpretation was that it's Wehem Mezut, but in actual fact, I have now checked, and it's just year 5. And for various reasons, that affects the argument about who comes first, Herihor or Payank. So it's always helpful to be able to go back to the original if you can. And those volumes of Janssen Winkeln are great, but they are expensive. And also only in Egyptian. There's nothing else to them. Martin asks, why was it necessary to strip the tombs of the precious materials? According to foreign laws, Egypt was the land overflowing with gold. Yeah, Martin, so I think it was. So in the New Kingdom, particularly when Egypt's at the peak of its power, 18th and 19th dynasties, it's a wealthy country, and it pretty much was for the whole of its history, thanks to its agricultural productivity. But in the times of empire, it was able to draw on vast quantities of resource from the territories it had conquered in the form of tribute and also access to their natural resources. So one of the reasons for the Egyptians' interest in Nubia is it was a great source of gold. So by controlling the territory a little way to the south of the First Cataract, they had access to the gold mines in the Wadi al-Alaki, I think, and those sorts of areas, and they could bring lots of gold in, and gold could be then traded and blah, blah, blah. The situation, as far as we understand it, from the beginning of the 20th dynasty onwards, is that Egypt was beginning to lose control of its overseas territories. So by the time of the 21st dynasty, it had certainly lost control of Nubia, and it had lost control of its territories up into the Levant as well. So that tribute's no longer coming in. And at the same time, it was spending a lot of money. It was spending a lot of money on armies, fortifications. So there were lots of people who needed paying. So our understanding is that there came a point where they realized that there was an awful lot of value locked away in the precious materials buried with kings, and so probably thanks to the economic need for it, but also the importance of not allowing these precious materials to fall into the hands of robbers, they took the decision to strip the precious materials away and make use of them for themselves. So there's probably those two motivations alongside one another. But I think the key is in understanding that by the late New Kingdom, the economic situation and the situation for what had been its empire was very different for Egypt. Again, thanks for your question. Leanne asks, was Herihor's face removed or damaged and no tomb due to his reclamation orders? I don't absolutely know why or when his figure was defaced in the Khonsu temple, Leanne, but it might well have been that it was much later than this, in the result of, say, Coptic iconoclasts. I'm afraid I don't know that. I don't think the fact that there's no tomb, as far as we know, would be due to the reclamation. Again, we don't exactly know when the precious materials were stripped from the tombs. Probably it happened gradually over quite a long period of time. You might remember that the names of every single one of the chief priests from Herihor down to the end of the period, Susenes the second, third, they're all mentioned in connection with the movement of royal mummies, inspections, caches, etc. We don't know in each of those cases exactly what was happening and whether in each case there was the opportunity for them to strip some gold away or whatever. But it may well have been that it was happening throughout that time, in which case it's not only Herihor who was responsible, but also Pi-Negem the first and all of his successors right down to the end of the period. And of those people, most of them seem to have had a decent burial, a decent, respectful burial, even if well, in all cases they turned up in the royal cache. So no, I think we need to look for another explanation. I can't see that there's any good reason that we're aware of why Herihor would not be treated in the same way as Pi-Negem the first, Masahata, Pi-Negem the second, etc. And in general, even the very sort of the people you'd think there would be the most reason not to be accorded a full burial. So, for example, Akhenaten, they are given some sort of respectful burial, even if it's not with full ceremony. So I suspect that the Egyptians just actually found it very difficult to bring themselves to, not bury people properly. I think that was really probably beyond the pale. So I don't doubt that Herihor was given a proper burial somewhere. And I haven't said it yet, but I think if I had to bet what happened, I would think that he was originally buried somewhere with a certain amount of grave goods, and that his tomb, along with so many others at this time, was probably then revisited and his body reburied. That seems to me the most likely. I'm not saying that is what happened, but that seems to me most likely. And in the process of being moved from here to there, it was either lost, or there's a cache tomb that hasn't yet been discovered, and that is quite possible. Or sorry, one last possibility: there's a cache tomb which has been discovered, and we don't know about it because, as with initially the royal tomb and also with the tomb of the three foreign wives, they were discovered by locals who successfully managed to slowly seed things onto the antiquities market without anybody actually knowing that they discovered a tomb. It could well be that that's how the bracelet and this mysterious jewelry of Herihor came onto the market. Somebody at some point we don't know about in the past came across either his tomb or a cache, and slowly began moving things onto the market. Who knows? But thanks, good question. Righty-ho, so that's the end of the questions, folks. I'm just going to quickly go back to the chat. nice to see, as always, nice to see your thank yous. Thank you for your thank yous. Lovely to see your positive comments. Thank you. Oh, excellent talk yet again. You never fail to deliver. Thank you, Carol. That's very kind of you. Yeah, so thanks for joining me. Peter will be in touch. Thank you for your kind comment. Just getting to the end. TTXXX, what a find it would be, says Martin. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Arthur says, if 4 of them are missing, it seems more likely to be a cache that's not been discovered. Yeah, there is actually, I think so something I haven't said is that, as with previous talks, I will, I'll try and find a couple of hours to just put together some notes that I can put onto my website with further reading and all the various things I've been looking at. So once I've got that ready, I'll post it. I'll post the details online. So yeah, if you want to follow any of these things up, I'll try and make sure that you can do that. Yeah, there is in fact an article by David Aston. David Aston's written a lot of articles on this kind of thing. One of which is on the possibility that there is another cache, which is either out there and as yet undiscovered, or has actually been found, as I was saying, but just without us actually realizing it. Leanne asks, next lecture. I don't know, actually, at this point, Leanne. Yeah, I don't know. The next few weeks are slightly up in the air for me because I was meant to be flying to America on Sunday. I'm now not doing that because of COVID rules and visa problems. That was actually to go and do a lecture in Michigan, but can't do that. I am doing a lecture, an in-person lecture next Friday, all being well, in, oh God, where am I going? Spalding in Lincolnshire, for the Spalding Gentlemen's Society. Delighted to say, one of the oldest such groups anywhere in the country, a couple of 100 years old, I think. Then it's possible I'll be going to Egypt at the end of the month. I don't even want to mention that in case I jinx it, but it's possible I'll be going to Egypt. And I got 1 or 2 other things that I need to be getting on with. So I don't immediately have any plans for next talks, but I'm sure that I will get back to it sometime soon. Oh, I am doing, sorry, I should say, I am doing a talk for the Egypt Society of Victoria, which is based at Monash University. That's going to be on Egypt under Kushite rule. I don't remember the date. It's in the middle of October. Have I put it on my website? I'm not sure. I'll do that. Yeah, so there is another talk coming up at an Australia friendly time as well. Hope that helps. Yeah, and yeah, I've been very busy with lectures in the last few weeks, 3 in the last 2 days. So I just need to gather my thoughts and have a look at my diary. But yeah, if you have suggestions for topics, let me know, as always. And I'll see you at the next one, what if that may be. Sorry, I need to get better organized, probably, don't I? Okay, right. I think we're at the end of the questions and the end of the comments. So again, thanks very much for coming along today. Great to see you. Great to have you all here. Great to have a chance to talk about Herihor with you. Hope you enjoyed it. I will see you again sometime soon. Look out for those announcements about notes and other talks and everything else going on. Stay safe and well, and I'll see you all again soon. Okay, bye for now.